The collapse of Rick Harrison and Austin Chumlee Russell in the courtroom marked the devastating climax of one of the most shocking and dramatic legal cases in reality television history. The contrast between their long-standing personas as trusted, knowledgeable hosts of Pawn Stars and the damning revelations laid bare during the trial was too much for even them to withstand. For over a decade, the duo had built not just a business, but an empire of trust, curiosity, and American entrepreneurship woven into the fabric of pop culture. Their TV presence was a mainstay for millions, a nostalgic window into artifacts of history seasoned with negotiation, humor, and a sense of discovery. But beneath the surface of success lay a secret operation prosecutors would come to describe as one of the most sophisticated financial laundering schemes ever tied to entertainment personalities. At first, the allegations seemed like fiction, fueled by vague claims and public curiosity, but the courtroom drama revealed cold, hard facts. $15.7 million in laundered funds, entire networks of shell companies, and a 7-year campaign of financial deception meticulously orchestrated from behind the counters of the iconic gold and silver pawn shop. What made the fall even more jarring was how meticulously Harrison and Russell had protected their public image. From heartfelt press conferences to interviews in which they proclaimed their commitment to fairness and transparency, they played the part of wrongfully accused businessmen to perfection. Their defense team clung tightly to the argument that any questionable financial activity had been conducted through professional advisors, implying the duo were perhaps negligent but never malicious. But the prosecution countered with forensic precision. Signed documents, shell companies registered with false addresses, communications instructing staff to restructure assets to avoid detection. The contrast between Harrison's composed on-screen demeanor and the trembling man in court was heartbreaking to watch. And Chumlee, long portrayed as the lovable, slightly bumbling foil to Harrison's stern expertise, now looked nothing like the comic relief fans had come to adore. As witness after witness chipped away at the story they had told the public, the defendants' expressions shifted from disbelief to desperation. The trial gripped the nation. Legal experts called it unprecedented, not just for the scale of the financial crimes, but because the defendants were icons of transparency in the public imagination. The courtroom was packed daily, not just with media and spectators, but with longtime fans clinging to hope that their beloved TV stars were innocent. They held signs. They wore merch. Some even traveled across the country to stand outside the courthouse. But facts are stubborn things. Prosecutors meticulously connected each financial maneuver to a calculated effort to hide illicit income, outlining a blueprint of deception that was hard to ignore: emails, transactions, corporate charts, FBI testimonies. The turning point came when a forensic accountant from Georgetown University laid out the costs associated with maintaining the shell corporations, millions of dollars spent purely to conceal. The defense faltered. The courtroom atmosphere shifted. Even the most loyal supporters watching from a gallery began to absorb the possibility that what they were witnessing was not a government overreach, but a reckoning. The final moments of the trial were soaked in tension. Judge Eleanor Blackwood, who had presided with stern impartiality, delivered the verdict with surgical clarity. Guilty on all counts, maximum sentence, restitution, forfeiture of all assets. The room held its breath as the weight of the words sank in. The men who once haggled over Civil War rifles and vintage Rolex watches were now being sent to prison, possibly for the rest of their lives. Harrison and Russell, seated side by side at the defense table, didn't speak. They couldn't. The shock was too much. As Judge Blackwood concluded the reading, their bodies gave out, slumping forward in eerie unison. Gasps erupted. Security swarmed. Courtroom staff called for medics. The sight was surreal, 2 household names unconscious in front of the nation. Their fall from grace broadcast not in a scripted finale, but in the stark reality of a federal courtroom. Their families, seated just rows away, looked frozen in disbelief. The courtroom, so tense just minutes before, was now chaotic with emotion. For the millions who had grown up watching Pawn Stars, who had admired Harrison's sharp wit and Chumlee's humor, the scene felt like a betrayal of narrative, a gut punch to those who still believed in the American dream the show once symbolized. What remains now is a legacy forever changed. The gold and silver pawn shop, once a landmark of Las Vegas culture, is now a symbol of what happens when greed overtakes integrity. Harrison and Russell, once celebrated for turning history into entertainment, now serve as cautionary tales of how far one can fall when the truth finally catches up. Their fate will be studied, debated, and perhaps even fictionalized in the years to come. But the verdict is final. The curtain has fallen, and the stars of Pawn Stars have faded, not in a blaze of glory, but in silence inside a courtroom that showed no favor to fame, collapsed under the weight of their conviction, unconscious in front of the very audience that once idolized them. The courtroom fell into chaos. Medical personnel were called immediately. Paramedics entered through the rear of the courtroom, pushing past reporters and onlookers who had crowded the exit trying to catch one last glimpse of the fallen stars. Oxygen masks were applied, vital signs were checked, and after a few tense minutes, both Rick Harrison and Austin Russell, better known to the world as Chumlee, were stabilized and transported by ambulance to a nearby hospital for evaluation. Cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the dramatic fall of two of reality television's most iconic figures to a stunned and divided public. Outside, crowds gathered as fans, critics, and curious onlookers waited anxiously, some still in disbelief, others vocal in their condemnation. News outlets scrambled to break the story, their headlines filled with phrases like "Pawn Stars' Empire Crumbles," "Rick and Chumlee Sentenced to Life," and "From Icons to Inmates." Inside the hospital, both men regained consciousness within hours, though their emotional state remained fragile. According to sources close to the family, Harrison had to be sedated following repeated panic episodes, while Russell alternated between long stretches of silence and brief moments of weeping. Doctors later confirmed the collapse was caused by acute stress reactions, exacerbated by dehydration and lack of sleep, unsurprising given the intensity of the trial and the magnitude of the sentence. Their attorneys released a brief statement that evening, thanking the medical staff and reiterating their plans to appeal. "Today's outcome is deeply disappointing," the statement read, "but this legal fight is far from over. We believe there are significant grounds for appeal, and we intend to pursue every legal avenue available." But for the millions watching around the world, the damage had already been done. The heroes of Pawn Stars, those quirky, knowledgeable, and shrewd Las Vegas businessmen, were now convicted felons, their legacy forever marred by financial deceit. As the days passed, new layers of the case began to emerge, shocking even the most loyal fans. According to sealed documents released following the verdict, federal investigators had been building their case for nearly 6 years. What had begun as a routine financial audit of a shell company loosely connected to the gold and silver pawn shop quickly escalated when auditors noticed recurring transfers from offshore accounts in Belize and the Cayman Islands. These weren't isolated events. They were part of a sprawling web of entities, each serving a very specific function, some to shield assets, others to move funds discreetly, and a few explicitly created to obscure the final destination of laundered money. The web included dozens of limited liability companies, foreign trusts, and forged service contracts with vendors that did not exist. In total, over 40 shell companies were identified, with connections extending beyond the U.S. into South America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Federal agents from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, and the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division worked in tandem, often conducting undercover surveillance and issuing subpoenas under seal to avoid tipping off the targets. Testimony revealed that informants within the organization provided key information, including detailed ledgers and login credentials to encrypted accounting systems. The most damning piece of evidence, however, came from a disgruntled former employee who had been terminated in 2019. In an effort to negotiate leniency on unrelated charges, the individual handed over a hard drive containing years of internal communications, financial logs, and backup documents. Among them was a 67-page dossier titled Operational Risk Mitigation, believed to be authored by Russell, that outlined procedures for laundering funds, evading IRS scrutiny, and deflecting suspicion using charitable donations and public appearances. This document was presented during the final week of the trial, and it stunned the courtroom. Prosecutors read excerpts aloud. Stage 3 cash influxes masked via antique acquisitions, appraisal padding necessary for IRS undervaluation, media coverage to divert attention from withdrawals. Every sentence seemed to contradict the public image the duo had maintained for over a decade. Perhaps most disturbing to fans was the realization that many of the show's on-screen transactions, the heartwarming discoveries, the friendly haggling, may have been orchestrated to provide cover for illegal financial flows. Some of the customers seen on camera were later revealed to be actors or associates involved in the broader scheme. The line between entertainment and deception had been completely erased.